there are a minority which are beneficial in immigration. The problem is that even legal immigration has been blown so far out of proportion in terms of the numbers and the quality standards going lower that even a lot of legal immigrants aren't helping. But if another country produces geniuses and experts and they want to come to your country, don't say no. Like, we're talking high quality here, with high standards. We're talking like, increase your population by no more than, say, 0.1% a year from these very high standards immigrants. Maybe probably less than that. And only people who, like, it's genuinely meritocratic for you to claim from other countries. The US is maybe a little different. It has a history of welcoming people who simply want to be American. But even then, only from Europe, and only when it was new. Not sure that's really makes sense anymore. But for someone like the UK, where we're already densely packed and like pretty much saturated, that should be our standard. Only the highest standards of like people who are genuinely assets to our nation, genuinely great from other countries who want to become British, should be allowed. Everyone else rejected. Yeah, no, Ronald, not only European are truly capable of that, but mostly. There are members of other races that are capable of it. It's less by proportion of the race, but others are. And it's hard to say that today, given we have so many negative examples, but they do exist. Yeah, as Meatball, that's a very good point. These women need to learn that having a presentable or stately manner does not mean that you're good or ethical. Indeed, some of the worst villains in history, in fact, probably most of the worst villains in history, have been visually presentable, have said the right things. It matters what you do. Yeah, there are, as Pixar says, there are foreign nations who are pretty good, the Japs. In my opinion, the Japs are basically the second best culture in the world, after European. European-derived, obviously. Because they got the furthest. Second furthest, obviously. When Europeans were at, what was it, like roughly industrial or like late 18th century, early 20th, or late 1900s, early 2000s. What am I saying? Late 1800s, early 1900s, that kind of era, right? At that point, the Japanese were at sort of roughly, they got to late medieval on their own, is what I'm trying to say. The West got to, yes, on their own. They got into information era, as far as you can get. Japs got to late medieval. No one else got further than that, as far as I know. Sorry, I messed up the way I was putting that. I always get confused between saying by the century and saying by the 100 of year. I try to say 100 of year because it's less confusing for people, but I got them confused at some point there. But yeah, anyway, point is, of all the cultures in the world, Europeans got the furthest, obviously, and are still going. Japs got to late medieval, and everything past late medieval in any other culture is Western. They just use what Europeans had already achieved. Yeah, yes, Eudaimonia. That's true. I'm not saying that they were like cool. I'm not saying they were reasonable or respectable at any point there, but they gave, in terms of development, they got further than anyone else except the West. National Freeloxian Day, which is a strange name. I'm not sure why you're calling yourself that. Says, do you expect the Darkies to invent the wheel or something? No, they didn't even get to. You couldn't even call what Africa achieved on their own classical or like Dark Ages. You couldn't even call it early medieval at a stretch. No, it was just ancient. it was like not even. I don't think they even have metal working on their own, did they? It was just Stone Age. It was just Stone Age up until Western colonizers invaded. They uninvented the wheel multiple times. Yeah, literally Stone Age. Yeah, no, that's fine. Like, to be honest, I'm not going to, from an evolutionary perspective, that's not as bad as it sounds, because each of the various ages of humanity got shorter and shorter as progressive they went on. The Neolithic, sort of Stone Age, was very long. If we start at anatomically modern humans roughly 200,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago to about sort of, 12, 15,000 years ago. And then you've got roughly sort of around that broad area, you've got sort of start of metalworking, Bronze Age, and then agriculture around that same time. Iron Age, each one getting a little bit shorter than the previous ones. And then you got Classical, which was sort of a leap up, but then obviously went back down again. And then Medieval, which is possibly longer than Classical was. I'm not sure. But then that was non-monotonic. It's a rare incident in human history. And then Renaissance, shorter. Industrial, much shorter, but still like climbing greatly in terms of what we're actually capable of, technologically speaking. And then Atomic, and then Information Age. Each one much shorter than the last. So in terms of just like random assignment, if you were to put a pin on that map, you're much more likely to throw the pin at Stone Age. So I'm not saying Africa deserves to be lauded for its achievements, just that, we've got all these continents, all these various groups of peoples. They happened to be the one that was still in Stone Age when we were in Information Age. Daddy will says by 2500 we should experience 3 eras per minute. That's pretty funny. Japanese culture is inherently different to British, and both should be allowed to develop on their own without massive exchange, or else both will lose what makes them beautiful. Sure, yes. But any strategy used by one which is clearly better than the other will be adopted. And there are some things in one culture, like equilibriums are very bloody complicated, especially across a whole culture, and their genetics are going to form a different equilibrium, even with our technology, than our genetics are going to form. So it is going to be different. So yeah, we get the same thing, but they also still get to be technologically equivalent, which is probably better for the species, but also inevitable. Ronald says that genetic point is exactly why, but they work so hard, bro, isn't a good reason to allow immigration. Yeah, no, I understand. There are people in other genetic groups who can form a workable equilibrium in our societies, where their genetics are either more similar or just compatible with the genetics of the people that are in our society. They exist. They're rarer, but they exist. And I say it's worth us taking the best and the brightest from other genetic groups, where it seems to be viable. Just that our default, it should default to none. And when we have the availability, when it's fair weather, when we open the gates to the best and brightest. Ronald says the equilibrium happens due to the culture. Culture occurs as a large part from genetics. If you allow foreign genetics, it permanently alters the culture, and you lose it for good. Do you think I'm talking about millions here? I'm talking about, say in the UK, a few tens of thousands in total of the best and the brightest of other races. You don't need it to be an ethno-state for it to be healthy. Even then, you could probably have more than that. The thing is that, think of it this way. If you do that, you're not going to end up with a segment of your population who are a different race entirely. The reason that's happened is because of unchecked mass immigration. But it doesn't have to. If you do best and brightest selective immigration, what happens is that the majority of the population, the vast majority, adopt the worthwhile traits from those who are imported, if there are any, and just yoink them. Because if there are traits in other races which are worthwhile, and bear in mind, we're talking about an example where you could have billions of potential traits, trillions, depending on how you count it. There's going to be some in other races that we could use, we could integrate in a new way. We might as well have them. So just bring in just the best and the brightest of other races, just not that many of them, just enough that you can sort of have that variation, have that flexibility. Genetically, biologically, evolutionarily, it is a good idea to have that genetic flexibility, to have not just total purity of genetics. Have a little bit of chaos, a little bit of impurity in the system so that it can stay moving. You don't want to stagnate. And you also don't want the best and the brightest to work for your enemies. Google says, just let a few tens of thousands into your kingdom, Goyim. They won't change it. Yeah, okay, if we're talking kingdom, where the population might only be, say, 1 million, 10,000 is a lot. If we're talking 60 million, and we're specifically talking best and brightest, and we're specifically talking 10,000 total, that's a bit different. Ronald says you need only about 0.001% of the breeding stock so you can incorporate the useful traits and filter the bad ones, not arguing for total 100% pure Bavarian phenotype, Lemau. Yeah, it sounds like we're saying roughly the same thing. Maybe we would differ on the exact numbers, the exact methodology, but we don't disagree. You don't want 100% absolute purity of your genetic group. You might end up stuck in an evolutionary rut, a local maximum that you can't roll out of. You need variation. You need to keep struggling against reality and variation. And why not take the genuine talent of other nations, especially when you're only selecting the best and brightest? Eudaimonius, is brain drain desirable in these shitholes? I suppose what you could argue is if we're pointing towards a worldwide improvement rather than just an improvement of our own nations, then no. The answer to that, Eudaimonia, is conquest. Right? Any disagreeers in chat? Like, modern day conquest is less workable, like actual like physical crusade conquest. But economic, social, cultural conquest, absolutely. The only reason the West isn't doing it is because it's been hollowed out. Its spirit has been wasting away. It's not dead, but it's been wasting away. It's coming back to life now. But once it does, there is absolutely no reason that the West cannot dominate the world culturally and economically, convert every nation into a form that serves us better, and not just us, but all of humanity, because the West has the correct answers for how humanity should operate. Not to say that we need to necessarily impose it on China, who are notably very different, or Russia, who are somewhat different. They can run their own, the show their own way as well, but gradually their values will align to whatever makes more sense. Genetics may mix, but genetics may mix in such a way that the better nations predominate in the genetic race. Or we may end up being multiple nations that have our own workable strategies into the stars. That's okay too. But the West has an opportunity right now to claim most nations as their own vassals, perhaps even officially to claim it. Because a lot of nations around the world would not be resistant to this. The only reason it hasn't happened is because the West has lost its gumption. China's doing it right now because China has some gumption because they've stolen it from the West directly through corrupt politicians. But yeah, conquest of a form is the correct answer. My ponderance of that I've been doing for several years of there are only 3 solutions to the problem of useless countries. 1, delete, which is not a nice option. None of these are good, by the way. 2, babysit, also not a good option and is what we've been doing for at least 100 years. And 3, upgrade. Possibly the least objectionable. And in terms of upgrade, within upgrade, there are several different ways that you could do it. 1 is literal physical upgrades, which we don't really have the capability of doing that yet. We may do later, but forget that for now. 2 is a genetic upgrade, which would take time, but may work. And then 3 would just be more so of a cultural upgrade, where you find ways to make use of even the most sub-Saharan of Africans, which I'm sure there is something that you could find a use for economically. I mean, let capitalism at it. Let them figure it out, whatever it ends up being. The third of those options is by far the most humane of these solutions, to be honest, but it essentially requires cultural and economic conquest, which is what I'm recommending for the future of humanity. I think I'm willing to recommend that. Of these options, it is by far the best. And specifically, we should be doing that. That conflict, that competition is on. China is getting a head start right now because they've shot us with the starting pistol before we could start running. And China and possibly others too. But we have easily the best opportunity to succeed as long as the others aren't cheating. As soon as we start competing properly, we will predominate as all Western nations. So that is our next objective, to culturally and economically conquer the world, or at least large parts of it. Think of it as in an RTS. When you start off, you hunt down resources. You start mining gold. You send out your units to find the mines for other resources as well. It's essentially that, except in this case, it's much more abstracted. We're talking about possessing the productive capability of other nations or other regions. And not through conquest. They would still have their own leadership. They still have their own politics, but their productivity would be turned strongly to serve us, much more strongly than it is now. So instead of them having their own like little shithole shanty towns, they would be replaced with Western industrial centers of a type, obviously whatever the people there are capable of dealing with, but of a type. If it turns out that production lines there are cheaper, then maybe that's something that you can do. Now, this is already sort of happening, but it's not really happening on our terms. And of course, we still need to make sure that we are doing a lot of this productivity in our own countries. So tariffs on this kind of stuff to make sure that we do keep a lot of this stuff at home so that we're, sustainable to change. Yes. But capturing the other nations of the world economically and culturally. And the cultural part is important as well. If you want Indians on the production line, then Americanize India or Westernize India or whatever, like China's trying to do with Africa. There's obviously loads of implementational concerns with this, but it's the most humane of the available options. I saw a couple of you suggesting delete. Bear in mind, I kind of get where you're coming from, but no one's going to go for that. Like the people of the West, one of our most identifiable features is that we are compassionate. That obviously can go wrong sometimes. It can go too far. It can be abused. But I think if left to its own devices, it's usually fine. People are not going to go for, well, the people in these countries are useless, but the land is useful, so let's just genocide them and use the land. Who is going to go for that? We've built our societies on humanity, being humane. No one here is going to go for that. You got to find a different option, a more realistic option. Duchess says, what about option 4, ignore? Well, I suppose so. The problem is, again, we're too compassionate, so it'll end up just falling back into babysit. The default option is babysit, unfortunately. If we do nothing, it'll end up being that. Right. I'll end it there, chat. Star Trek rules, no one's allowed to fuck. Hard to enforce. I suppose it's possible you could enforce that, but I don't think it would last, especially when China's not going to listen, are they? And China aren't doing it out of compassion. They're doing it out of raw bugman pragmatism, trying to claim in a way more aggressive than what I'm suggesting, the productive capability of these countries. They would, of course, keep doing that, no matter how much the West says stop. I suppose, actually, if China's in a dire situation, you can say, okay, end your adventurism into Africa and all across the world, and we have a moratorium on interacting with them. Problem is, it's a lot of resources to just waste. Then again, I guess you could say that there's enough resources in our own countries to get to the asteroids that will give us practically infinite resources. I'll remind you, chat, there's an asteroid in our solar system which contains 5 quintillion tons of gold. It hits Mecca. It's just like that. But the idea is that when we get to the stage of our development where we can send ships to the asteroid belt and mine asteroids, which is probably 150 to 200 years from now if we keep going at our current pace, and assume like AI is going to disrupt all of this, but never mind. Then we do not need to worry about resources on Earth anymore. But until then, we do to an extent.